So the audience know the YouTube link, right? I do not have the YouTube link, so I cannot invite my students.
It's the chat. It's in the chat. Can you see it?
Okay, I see in the chatting room. Okay. So we will start this webinar. It's our great honor to invite Dr. Christian Grant. He is a senior lecturer for digitalization and data science at the Institute of Applied Simulations at the Zurich University of Applied Science in Switzerland. He has contributed to technology-enhanced learning and mobile learning for more than 2 decades. He is also a co-inventor of micro-learning method. He started and implemented systems for learning analytics, inverted classroom practice, mobile learning, gamification, personalization, and adaptation, and seamless learning in higher education. The industry and international organizations. So he has a strong interest in the educational technology community. He was president of the Swiss Educational Technology Working Group of Higher Education Institutes, member of the board of the International Association for Mobile Learning, as well as the education chair of the European Association for Technology Enhanced Learning. He co-chaired many international conferences, including our APSCE conference. So let's welcome Dr. Christian Grant to introduce, to give us a talk about seamless learning and contextual design. Welcome you.
Thank you, Cinzia. It's a great honor to have this webinar with APSCE, and I'm really glad to have an outreach from Switzerland to the Far East and to Asia, which is not happening that often these days during our pandemic. I like also to mention that at my institution, the ZHAW, there's another Christian who also writes and talks about seamless learning, and I'm not that guy. So there are two Christians in our institution working on seamless learning, and we are not sharing our views in all aspects, and particularly not all views in the aspects that I will present today. So be aware that there might be contradictory things if you read something Zurich University of Applied Sciences, and there's something contradicting to my presentation that's probably from the other person. So let me check if this starts. Okay. So this presentation is about design decisions for learning experiences and educational technologies. This is really what I'm interested over the last 10 plus years in order to think about the structural and systematic approaches, how we bring technology into our classrooms, into our institutions, how do we have to change processes in a structured way. So I will present one or two solutions, but I don't dive so much into the practices, rather than more into the theory of educational design. And since it's in the title, seamless learning, we need to understand how context, which we talk about the design there later on, relates to seamless learning. And if we look back in the literature, Tak-Wai Chan and many, many others wrote in 2006 a seminal paper on mobile learning and the future of mobile devices in education. And there they emphasize the importance of context, and the learning context in particular, for the concept of seamless learning. And that's where the modern sense of seamless learning, of mobile seamless learning, actually arose. And it took a couple of years, it took another couple of years until another very important paper showed up, which is from Professor Lui and Professor Wong on a structured analysis of where we stand when it comes to seamless learning and what do you mean by seamless learning. And they came up with this very nice framework for structuring this particular field of seamless learning. And they found concepts like the transitions between this and the seams between formal and informal learning, between personal and social learning, between physical and digital spaces. The location was an important aspect across time. Then the ubiquitous access of learning resources, as well as multiple devices in class and multiple learning tasks involved with these devices, plus a couple of educational aspects like knowledge synthesis and multiple pedagogical models that are applied within the same design. So this framework, we will see popping up with the numbers for MSL 1 to 10 later on in my slides as well. So make sure you remember this. We will have a test afterwards. In this presentation, I will also draw heavily on three important books in which I published myself, and in which many of the scenarios that came to the insights that I will share with you today actually were described in greater detail. The one is the Seamless Learning in the Age of Mobile Connectivity from Lungxiang Wong, Marcelo Milrat, and Marco Specht from 2015. So it's at the edge of citability. The other one is rather recent, Seamless Learning, Perspectives, Challenges, and Opportunities from early last year. And the third one is from 2013. It's Increasing Access Through Mobile Learning from Mohamed Ali and Augustus Tsinakos. And in that last book, I basically outline parts of the principles that actually guide to the insights towards the end of my presentation. So if you want to dive deeper, these are basically the books that you really should have on your bookshelf, and will probably open on your desk too. So my question when we look in these books was, how do we generalize educational design systematically from educational scenarios? And I like to remind you that a great part of these three books is basically describing how do we do seamless learning in practice? What are the challenges of bringing mobile technologies into the educational game in order to bridge between contexts? And these scenarios are very important as an basically inspiration, but they don't really share a great deal of a systematic integration. And I'm a bit concerned about this, because when I'm in my institution and talk to my colleagues, and I'm so excited about seamless learning, I want to tell them, okay, how do you bring this concept into your classes about laboratory laboratory teaching in the life sciences, or in building management systems, or in talking about empirical simulations or machine learning? How do you integrate these concepts about seamless learning into different subject matters? And there I find it extremely important to have a systematic approach to tackle the educational design. So here, from now on, I talk about educational design, and I like to share with you my insight where seamless learning stands in our overall field of educational sciences. From my perspective, seamless learning actually extends the concepts of learning and educational design to a great deal that we haven't seen in that format since basically the 70s. So a brief refresher when what I mean when I talk about educational design. So I just skip over a couple of slides on a theoretical model that you should have heard and probably have heard in the past. So when I talk about educational design, I refer to planning and structuring learning experiences. So educational design is really about how do we organize conceptually our teaching, basically in class, in seminars, in informal settings, in non-formal settings, and so on. So what is our concept of structuring the learning experience? And there are a bunch of theories, as I mentioned. This is not new. This is basically foundations of educational science or didactics, if you like. And you will find it, for example, in the conditions of learning posed by Professor Garnier. And he showed like 9 types of phases of a learning process that actually guide good instruction. So this is like the central piece of instructional design as we know it today, and which is an industry term. So we have gaining attention, learning objectives, stimulating recall, like connecting to previous knowledge, presenting new aspects, guiding learners, performance, providing feedback, assessment, and supporting retention and transfer to other fields. And that's basically a circle, because once you have stimulated the transfer into other fields, you can actually take that as a new anchor for gaining attention to one of these aspects and then move forward. And so you have like a cyclic approach to instructional design from Garnier. And this had been very influential on a couple of models, including the one from Gilly Selman, which she calls Etivities, which is basically a model for activity patterns, how you integrate and introduce educational technology into your classroom, and basically online classrooms. Another model that had been influenced heavily by Garnier is the 8 learning events model. And you see there's one thing missing there, but the viewpoint is quite different. So whereas Garnier was focusing on the structural patterns of the educational or the instructional process, Leclerc and Poumay looked in their 8 learning events model at the kind of teaching practices occurring in these phases. And they did quite complex analysis with school teachers and looked what kind of learning activities show up in their educational designs. What are they using in their classrooms? And these include like presentations, so students receive, experimentation, meta-learning or reflection, debating, creating, exploration, imitation, and practice. And these are like 8 learning events that basically shape patterns, how we can think about our educational designs. And I stress this so much because I will return later to that very model. But since I mentioned 8 learning events, I actually have to mention another model, the conversational model, which gave rise to the APSCE model, which is kind of competing with the 8 learning events, particularly because the kind of events partly overlap and partly diverge in these 2 instructional design toolkits. So the conversational model had been introduced by Diana Lorilla, and she looks at how instruction actually takes place as a conversational process. And this process actually is moving back and forth like a pendulum. It's back and forth between a conceptual layer, which is here presented on top, and a practice layer, which is presented at the bottom of this slide. And this pendulum actually shapes a kind of conversations that people have with their peers on the right side and with their instructors or teachers on the left side. And there are certain kinds of activities that we can assign to this, such as acquiring, inquiring, producing, discussing, practicing, and collaborating. And you find that some of these terms somehow relate to the 8 learning events model that I just showed to you. And this is not by accident, basically, because if you look in classes, you find certain kind of activities and they appear over and over again. And the main difference between this model and the 8 learning events model is that this model emphasizes on the communication aspect, on the conversations. There's another model, or basically a theoretical model, proposed by Engström already in the 90s, which is called activity theory. And many of you have seen this triangular model already. And this model is basically looking at learning activities and reasons about what actually shapes an experience or an activity. So you have 2 parts in this diagram. The first part is on the right side, or actually the second part is on the right side, which are the outcomes. And it's very simple because it's only one box. And the magic of an activity actually isn't the outcomes. It's what happens in the process. And the process actually is shaped by a bunch of elements that interplay with each other. And one are the actors. This is the centerpiece. The other aspect are the topics and objectives. And then you have tools and resources that interconnect to it. And these many activities are guided by rules, outer communities, regulations, ethical insights, and so on. And obviously also by tasks that different actors bring into an activity. And there are many other models like the orchestration graph model by Pierre Dillenburg, which I use quite a bit and analyze quite a bit, which basically falls more or less into this basic design where Dillenburg's model actually focuses not so much on conversation, but or the activity structure, but on how do we orchestrate collaboration and different kinds of collaboration modes in our classes. I don't dive into that because I don't have a nice graphic for it. But what struck me when I looked at all these educational designs and many, many more that I did see here was that context, the learning context, is actually not present in these models. Okay. In Diana's model, you had the notion of the learning environment. But the learning environment is not the same as the context in seamless and mobile learning. It's something quite different. It's a passive, basically a passive box where people go in and do things and move out, and basically they leave the box. And it's a passive thing. It's basically a vessel for the activities to take place and pretty much nothing else. And when we look at mobile learning, we figure out that the kind of experiences that people have are tightly anchored into the context, and the context plays a much more active role on the model. So we can ask ourselves, where is context in educational design? So let's have a look at activity theory, because there's a very nice extension by Mike Sharples. And in 2009, Mike Sharples and colleagues, they proposed, oh yeah, there it is, down at the bottom, where Engström wrote accidentally, because he didn't know better at the time in the 90s. He had no mobiles back then. Okay, there it is. Instead of community, we call this context. And it's much more than just community, but the rest of the model basically stays the same. So we don't change the basic logic of the models by introducing a more active part down at the bottom. But then Engström also saw the outer parts, like the community, only as a vessel, just as the learning environment in L'Oreal's model. So in 2013, I took up this idea and just tried to connect it to a couple of technical concepts I've been working with in order to think about the relation of tools and context in the design of learning experiences. So when we talk so easily about context, we mean actually quite many different things, like context about social relations, that's community, the time, the location, identity and activity, and this is not from me. This had been proposed by Zimmerman and others as like a conceptual structure, how we can organize contextual concepts. Yeah, so when we look at this element at the bottom, the context, it's actually quite a big and complex thing. But then the whole model is not about the context and neither about the tools, it's about the actors. And the activity theory model, like many other models, they neglect somewhat that both the context and the tools actually have an active part in the learning experience, that they actually guide and replace in parts human interactions or change human interactions, so to say. But the model is anchored around the actors that will produce outcomes with the means of tools, objectives, rules, context, and tasks. So what do we do when we want to design learning experiences, when we want to design tools for learning experiences that take in concepts and play a more active role in the learning process? Okay, we need really to focus on the upper part, on the tools in this model. So what I did basically was then to flip around this model without basically changing the overall connection of the model. So basically I moved the actors a little bit up and the rules a little bit up and the objectives up, and suddenly we see a couple of new triangles appear. And let me go back first. You see also in the original model, you see a bunch of elements like production, consumption, distribution, and exchange. These are the social processes that take place in relation between the different elements according to Engström. So we see these new triangles just by rearranging the different elements of the model. Nothing really has changed, but we now can see different things. And this is interesting for our contextual design, because suddenly we have a more tool-centric perspective on what we do, and we can assign new labels into these new triangles that we see now. And this is basically focused on the central line between tools and context. This is automation, the relations between tools, rules, and tasks, and how they interact together. This is basically what we do when we digitize processes, we automate processes, and try to encompass along these relations. We have procedures, the rules, how people use tools. We have operations, how tools manipulate things in order to achieve objectives. It's more like a management term. And then at the bottom layer, we have adaptation, where we look at rules and tasks and contexts that actually influence the above process. And in Engström's original model, this is entirely invisible. This entire artifact-driven, the active role, is not visible in the original model. And I think if we want to design education technologies, we need to be aware of that there's a different perspective, and we're allowed to take a different perspective on the very same model. And since we have started already with rearranging things, I went a step further and been mingling everything up. So I see all the connection in one view. So not have one perspective and the other, because they're not mutually exclusive. In educational design, they happen at the same time. And this is important. because we need to understand that technology is not replacing teachers. It's augmenting our learning experiences and our habits, and so does context. And when we rearrange the original triangle or pyramid style model into a hexagon, then we see all the relations. And also, if we do it smartly, we see components of an activity. And I labeled them for you. The first and foremost component are the interactions. This is how the subjects, the actors, the learners, and the teachers interact with respect to a topic or learning objective. The second one is the process. So what are the rules and what are the tasks in order to interact with a learning objective? So they are not entirely independent, but we are looking at different facets of the same thing. And the third component is the environment. And this is the environment that Diana was focusing at. And this encompasses the resources and tools that we use in our education, as well as the context in which these tools and contexts are applied. And all this together leads us to the learning outcomes. So let's go back to seamless learning. And there you see that many of the seamless learning concepts that Professor Lui and Professor Wong have identified fall into the environmental element. And this is not so much a surprise, to me at least, because already in the 2006 paper from Chang, we've emphasized already that context plays an important role for seamless learning, and for mobile seamless learning particularly, because the mobile tools particularly, they relate to the context. So we somewhat expected to find many of these elements show up in this environmental concept. But then we have others like mobile seamless learning A, this concept that falls on clearly into the process level, and mobile seamless learning 9, which is encompassing multiple, that's the knowledge synthesis. This is basically how learners interact with a learning objective or a subject matter. So we find in Engelström's original model, we find our seamless learning parts if we are creative and rearrange things. And we are allowed to do this because we're not changing the theoretical framework as such. We're just using a different visualization, which is pretty cool, I think. But if you have, okay, let's go back. If you design educational experiences, and you use this framework, or you use Diana Lauria's framework, or you use Garnier's framework, you will find all these educational design frameworks leave out a great deal of things. And this can be troubling to people who are not educational designers by training. Yeah, because in educational design, you learn all these things that you have to take different facets. You have to have content skills, you have to have subject matter skills, you have to have procedural skills, etc., etc. And if you don't have that, and you see such a framework, you think, oh my God, they must be completely crazy. You never can do a course based on these kind of principles. So me and a colleague, we sat down and thought, okay, let's create a canvas. First, because canvases are extremely popular. And second, we want to have a visual tool that shows the relation from these very abstract heavy white models, like the conversational model, like orchestration graphs, like activity theory, and show how they relate to other aspects that we have to consider in our design practice, in our educational design practice in particular. And you see, it's not only the context box that is greatly complex. You see it on the middle right at the bottom. In the environment section, you see the context, and there we have location, we have time, we have relations. And over time, we realize, okay, there's another element that feeds into the concept of context, which is the interaction mode. Do people come in via mobile? Do they come in via laptop? Are they sitting in a brick and mortar lecture hall? Makes a massive difference on how you interact and how you experience your learning. But then you have the other elements as well, like tools and resources. I don't dive into that. And tasks and rules, where we look at learning activities, facilitating activities, procedures such as support and guidance. How do we design that and plan for that? As well as for the rules like prerequisites, when is a task completed, how do we grade things, what is the value of a certain task, as well as the roles, who takes what role in a certain activity, and what is the agency, who is in charge. And then on the other side, we have the outcomes, where we have products, which is what our lecturers do the most in Zurich. They focus on the products on the outcome side and mostly on the knowledge element. There's another aspect to the outcomes, which are competences, which is more procedural. And there you see the competences can lead to products, so an artifact that you deliver, or they can lead to experiences. And experiences are quite different from products, because it's not like you deliver an essay, but you look then in the terms of what did people do in order to achieve something, even if that something they have achieved is complete useless because they made a major mistake and the results are completely wrong, but the experience they took in are greatly more important than the actual product as a result. And in that case, we talk also about competences and skills that we look at that level. So we have to keep that in mind in order to visualize ourselves. What are all the design factors that play together? And here, with this respect, if you give this to a teacher, they say, no, I cannot do all this. This is not how I can do my planning. And okay, I shortcutted here. So I skip forward and move backward. Here. So teachers say, no, I cannot work with such a canvas. So we say, no, wait a moment. We have these event models that, for example, Leclerc and Pomey or L'Oréal have proposed for us. And basically what they give us are patterns that fill in most of the design decisions for certain activities. So for example, if we say experiment, there are certain kind of activity verbs that we give to the students. There are certain kinds of support that we need to give students in an experimentation phase, which are quite different to what we do when we are debating. And these kind of patterns we have collected as well, and collected like a quick prototype thing. So teachers can easily generate and fill in the most part of these canvases without actually working through all the details. And this is one important aspect when it comes to educational design, that we speed up the design process and not focus on every detail for a great deal of time, because time is something that we mostly don't have. So let's go back. So now we have this canvas. Let's go back to the abstract model. What we thought about ourselves when it comes to contextual design is that we look at the environmental element of the activity theory. And having this restructured model allows us to ask new questions, new technology-centric questions, where technology plays, and context as well, plays an active role. And when we look at the examples and the scenarios that have been described in the 3 books at the beginning, I used at the beginning at the presentation, then we find that these scenarios focus on context and use certain kinds of resources and integrate tools and resources so they fit and match with the context. So a great deal of focus on most of the scenarios where on how can we and what kind of tools can we use in a certain context. But when we go back here, we see the relation between resources and tools, according to Engelstrom, is a dialogue. The arrow goes in both directions. So when we went back to the literature, we found that the other direction is not so much research as the positive one, where the context is actively considered. So we were wondering whether certain kinds of tools and resources come with affordances that nudge people just by using a certain tool to be in a certain, to work with it in a certain context. Yeah, so do our resources and tools actually shape our learning environment actively? So what we did basically in order to see whether this works on a conceptual level, this is really foundational research, we created a learning app that had removed pretty much all contextual aspects apart from the interaction with the subject matter. So we removed the login procedure that requires you to log in into your learning management system. So you do it once in your course, and then you stay logged in all the time on your mobile app. We removed time constraints as much as possible. So you don't look which subject are you choosing, which are the topics that you can do, rather than you dive right into your questions and you do the learning experience. We remove the time constraints by making the learning activities extremely short. And a bunch of other aspects that we removed also from the system, including all the gamification elements, such as nudging, that we say, tell people, oh, it's a good time to learn when you're traveling with the train. And here you see a bunch of screens from the little app that we created. It's a little quiz app. And here I have, because that was the easiest to take, I have a multiple choice question that people go through. But the tool included a whole bunch of different kind of questions, like picture matching, sorting, close questions, and so on. So a great deal of different kinds of interactive learning activities that lecturers have designed. And we used a different tool that came in with the learning management system of our school. And that is basically the assessment tool. And we used the very same exercises in that tool as well. So our hypothesis was, if a tool is entirely context agnostic, then it should be used independently from a context. So we were expecting somewhat that our students were using the mobile app as a replacement to the original desktop version that they were using in the browser, because from the interaction point of view, there was absolutely no difference. We make clear of that. So this is basically a scenario. It's always cool if you ride the public transport and see your students working with your app. So this is how students actually learn. This is a very unusual learning scenario. You think about academic learning, you sit in your quiet study room or in the library or in a lecture hall and focus entirely on things. But hey, here we are in public transport. It's full of people, crowded as hell, and still we can have it as a learning environment. So what we found over 5 consecutive cohorts with together more than 700 participants, we found consistent use in different contexts compared to the reference tool. So rather than the mobile tool had been a replacement in all contexts and used in all contexts, it was particularly used in a very selective contexts that the students chose for themselves. And there are a bunch of arguments why this could happen, but the case is that our hypothesis was that if it's entirely decontextualized, we shouldn't see such a contextual differentiation, but we saw. So from our point of view, and this is important for seamless learning design, is that our tools shape our learning contexts and learning experiences. And we need to be aware of that. They're not passive, they're active elements of the experience. And we need to take greater attention to these kind of tools and this kind of role. And you can obviously ask the opposite direction in the other way. What can we do? How can we create context that they guide to certain tools so we don't have to prepare the tools for the students? It's also not answered yet. How can we solve this? Because that would make instructional design for homeschooling much, much easier. So far, we have been looking only at the activity level. But when you talk about seamless learning, it's greater. It's the themes that we are interested in, not just the activities and how we bridge between contexts. So we introduced into our canvas another layer, because it wasn't complex enough there. So we needed another layer in order to visualize to ourselves the procedural element that one activity connects to one or more other activities. So at the bottom, you see, okay, the outcomes basically feed in to a learner's portfolio, or in more technical terms, it generates learner records. And we can use this portfolio or these learner records in order to run analytics and use operators to feed then back into the process of our following learning activities. So here we are back at Garnier's perception of a cyclic learning process. Yeah, I like to raise you to that attention. We have, again, a cyclic process. We have the kind of learning activity, we have the interactions, we have the environmental roads leading to outcomes. These outcomes are used, aggregated, and compiled, and then analyzed, that then are used to determine which are the next best suited activity for a learner. And here we can talk actively about digitization, automation, and all these kinds of wonderful elements where digital tool can make a great deal, big deal of a difference. So this is our entire canvas at this point. This is a moving target as well. So maybe in probably 2 years or so, when we come up with a new edition of this, you will see at the bottom layer more fields and elements, just because we like it to make it more complex. And here I like to stress to you that we have talked so far about mobile seamless learning 1 to 9. And here at this bottom layer, we're actually talking about mobile seamless learning category 10. Yeah. At this category, we encompass, when we focus on different models, on the kind of portfolios and learner records that we need in order to provide input into our educational decisions, in our orchestration decisions, which we can also name as operators, if you like. So MSL 10 is actually focusing on this bottom layer. So we have our entire design space focusing on in this canvas. So we have our problem space reshaped from Professor Lui and Professor Wong's initial categorization into an activity-centric canvas model where still everything is in place. And here we need to be aware, when it comes to contextual design, that changes from the context actually influence how our operators behave on the procedural level down there, down at the bottom left. So if our interaction mode changes, our context change, and probably we want to offer students very different activities in order to make their learning experiences less seamfully, more seamless, anyhow, and have them in a more continuous learning experience. So we need to have a way to capture also these contextual elements in our learner records that are part of our learning outcomes, that we can then use to understand what are the next best suited activities for these learners. Here again, I talked about the patterns already. let's go over. When we look at these patterns, we find that these learning activity patterns, they focus on the pedagogy, which is good. But at the same time, learning and teaching practices are quite different. And Marion and myself, Marion Gruber and myself, we have figured out a bunch of activities which we call the absolute superstars of educational design. You probably haven't heard of them because everybody ignores them basically. No, not entirely, because informing shows up in Gagné's model. But we also saw that a great many educational designs that we get back from lecturers and teachers in schools and universities include other kinds of transitional activities or organizational activities that take time, that are important to consider, because that time is something that you don't have for your pedagogy. And if you run out of time, your experience basically ends because people are either lost, or they have to go to the next lecture, or they have to go home for dinner, and so on and so forth. So the other activities are decision-making, something that you do with the students, not that you do for the students. That would be operators. Grouping is something that takes a hell lot of time, we wouldn't imagine, in classes to make up good arranged working groups for your courses. And then we have transitions from one activity to the other, from one pedagogical activity to the other. And I labeled this with a running person, because that, when we look at our seamless learning scenarios from the books, that is basically what people do. They go to the next place. They move physically into a new context. But you have that in schools too. If you go from your classroom into your school's lab, you move the entire class. And everybody who did that with 40 students or 20 students even in a primary school, you know that this is really exciting phase in your classroom, because you can lose everybody everywhere. And but when we look at these organizational activities, then these transitions are basically where context plays a massive role. This is like the kind of organizational activity that we need to consider as well when we move between contexts, and that when we talk about seamless learning and seamless learning as an educational design principle. And so far, I haven't seen much literature talking about transitions between learning experiences and the role in the educational experiences of this transition. So far, the label seamless learning suggests that we want to get rid of these transitions. But this is not entirely the case. If you look at the scenarios, these transitions are valuable time for reflecting things. They are valuable time to see new things and connect to different elements. So I think we should pay much more attention to this transitional element. Yeah, so we need to focus again on the environment and need to look at what are the changes in the environment that lead to the transition. To which elements do we transit to? So this leads to a whole bunch of open questions. And this is my last slide, and I will close. So we have a few minutes of time for questions. And one thing is, what are the types of transitional activities? Yeah, we have a whole bunch of contextual elements. And these contextual elements in combination may require different types of transitional activities. Me and my group, we are focusing right now on the interplay of multiple devices on the effect of shaping the learning environment, and how can we bring students in different settings with their multiple devices together to shape more complex technical scenarios in which they can work. Then what are the contextual effects on learning activities? Yeah, this is greatly understudied at this point. We don't really know what context actually plays as an active element in a learning experience, simply because we were ignoring it so much. And finally, what are the procedural effects of context on our learning experiences. And I'd like to close here. And thank you very much for this opportunity to inspire you, hopefully, and lead you to a bit of the reasoning that have led to the designs and concepts I've been talking about and showing in my publications over the recent years. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks Dr. Grant's speech. Dr. Grant's talk focused on mobile seamless learning and the learning events model in educational design and the digital transformation of higher education. This webinar is hosted by the Special Interest Group of Classroom Ubiquitous and Mobile Technologies Enhanced Learning. I am the SIG chair, Tingjia Xu, and I'm the professor in the Department of Technology Application and Human Resource Development in National Taiwan University. This is the first webinar of the Asia Pacific Society for Computers in Education this year. We thank the invited speaker, Dr. Christian Grant. If you have any question, please use the Q&A function. And I have one simple question. Can we download your app from Google Play or Apple Store or the internet?
It was a highly experimental app, and it had a couple of flaws that are not so much a problem in the setting in which we used it.
Okay.
But because it's entirely decontextualized, it requires a bit of work to restructure it. But I'm happy if there are people who ask for it, because not many people have asked for it in the last 2 or 3 years. I'm happy to give it an overhaul and push it out if you want to try it out and see how the concept works in your classes.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay. I cannot see anyone ask any question in the Q&A function. Let's wait for 1 more minute. If anyone have question, please use the Q&A function. Oh, there is one question in the Q&A function. What is the difference between seamless learning and experiential learning? Okay,
So,
Dr. Green.
So the major difference between seamless learning and experiential learning is basically at which point you anchor your learning experience. So if you like, we're always in educational design terms, we talk about learning experiences. So if you think about it, there's not much a great deal of being in a difference of being having an experience in the classroom or having an experience outside. Experiential learning, or situated learning, if you like, is basically situated in a setting. And the major difference between seamless learning and this kind of situating people in settings and allowing them to have practical experiences focus on different facets. So I would say the major difference here is that seamless learning focuses on the overall process, how you guide people through different phases of that experience, whereas the kind of situating people in experiences would focus more on the task itself.
Okay, there is a second question.
Thank you for the great summary. What would you advise for improving collaboration as a learning tool? Oh, this would be, I fear that this is a question with respect to what tools should we use in class to foster collaboration. And this is kind of complicated because there are so many different tools around, and many of them are really, really good. Some of them are outstanding, and none of them are excellent. So the continuation here is what is the approach when it comes to the scenarios? Okay, let's go back into my slides a little bit. Go back to my canvas. Here we go. Here we go. So go back to the canvas. So when we talk about collaboration, the approach would be that we look at the setting, we look at our interactions. What are the objectives that we want to achieve, and what are the actions? So there you see the social plane, the collaboration on the outer end. So we say, okay, this is like classroom collaboration, or small group or big group collaboration, or single learning activities. And you can have them intermixed. So you can have individual learning, and then you go in small groups, then you go back to individual learning, then you go back into a classroom scenario. This is kind of arrangement that how you move through the overall process. But then the second part of the design approach would be, once you have figured out what is the social plane on which people interact, is to think and reason on the rules side, what are basically the roles in the play. And one important part here on the task level is, what is your role as an instructor? Think about deeply. Are you in the front? Are you in the back? Are you involved? Yeah, makes a big difference. And on the rules end, when we talk about roles in the process, we also have to talk who is in charge, who takes agency in which element of the activity. And this kind of agency involvement of students and instructors, this balancing out, makes a great deal how the social plane is actually experienced. So we talk, and there we go back to, to this element here. No, this one. We talk here about the procedural level, and how this procedural level interacts with the interaction level. That would be how we foster collaboration. Yeah, and you see, when I talk about collaboration, that's quite different to the environmental level. Yeah, so when you look at the great deal of literature, such as Pierre Dillenburg's work, then they basically ignore that there's an environment as such. Yeah, you see it only as a showcase, but and that's simply because they are focusing on the interaction and the procedural side of things. We have another question. Do you want to read it?
Okay. How can seamless learning trigger students' interest? I think it is very important. Yeah, because in 24 hours, our student will learn anytime, anywhere.
Well, I think that when you're students, you cannot do no learning, basically because your mind always works around it. One of the important elements, and there we have to go to the full canvas, to this one, is that seamless learning as such doesn't trigger interest. This is an activity that you have to think in your design. Where are your students? Where are they coming from? What kind of agency do they have when it comes to your subject matter? What are the relations here? But what seamless learning can do for you is that you take the outcomes and feed them in through the process and reduce the transitions from one activity to the other, the hurdles for the transitions from one activity to the other. And what we saw, for example, in the pandemic in my school was that we started off with a hybrid model where half of the class was at home, half of the class was in the lecture hall. And many students found that extremely difficult to tackle with. And simply because the transitions between the two elements were not existing, they were not considered. And seamless learning is actually addressing that kind of problem by saying, no, wait, we have to be aware that the context of the students in the different interaction modes, online or in class, is so different that we need to find a way to balance this out. And if you take hybrid learning in how it's done in many universities these days, in Europe at least, then that basically means you need to have a student assistant or a teacher who actually controls basically the second line of the interaction mode. When you're in class, you cannot focus to be online. It creates total distress, not only with the students, it's also with the lecturers. So seamless learning is not giving you an answer to interest, but it gives you an answer how do you avoid losing students.
Okay, thank you very much. Before we end this webinar, I would like to introduce the next webinar. Okay, so because time's up, we have to end this section first. Let's thank Dr. Grant first, and we can see the next webinar slide. Please, Alex. Okay. I am also one of the speakers of the next webinar named STEM Education in K-12, an International Perspective. Let me introduce this webinar briefly. STEM education is an important agenda in K-12 schools in the 21st century for developing young students with problem-solving ability and digital creativity to meet the challenge in the digitalized society. The successful implementation of STEM education in K-12 K-12 schools need coherent strategies in the aspects of curriculum development. So we invite the international speakers from different countries to share the insights of the major practice and the existing challenges and the future plans for implementing STEM education in K-12 schools in their own countries. And discussions will focus on the critical issues for accommodating needs of K-12 schools, for suitable curriculum integration to deliver STEM education across different grades students, and professional development for teachers to engage students in STEM education. We welcome all of you to join our next webinar. Thank you very much. And now we will close this section. Let's thank Dr. Grant once again. Thank you very much. Thank you. You agree our invitation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you too. It was a great honor.
Bye-bye.